Okay, this is my recording of a summary of the results from the quiz on Module 3, which cover the topic of internal analysis. As you remember, the grading in the course, of course, is based on a forced curve, which means that the top 40%, at least will get A's in the course. Next 40% will get A minuses or above. And then the bottom 20%, typically, as long as they're exerting effort, will at least get a B+. So the score summary, the distribution statistics, and this may have changed slightly from what I presented in class because I've had a few students who've had to correct a few, give some additional points to in a couple cases. But it's about the same. The maximum is 100. As I said, a couple of students have got 100 on this quiz. The minimum was 48.3 and the mean was 78.2. So a little bit lower mean than we've had in the previous quizzes. The grade ranges, again, the equivalent of an A would be, so the top 40% were 82.5 and above. The next 40% were 67 to 82.5. And then the B plus range, or the bottom 20%, would be about a score of 48.3 to 67. Now, the module contained 25 questions, 15 true-false, 9 multiple choice, and 1 matching question. The quiz questions were separated into 5 topic areas: strategy, positioning, activities and activity systems, trade-offs, competitive advantage, and added value. In terms of challenging quiz questions, there are 20 out of the 25 that at least 70% of all students answered correctly, and that's been my cutoff. So anything that at least 20-70% of all students answered correctly, then if there's uncertainty about those 20 questions, your first resource should therefore be your fellow students, because obviously, like I said, if you answered it incorrectly or got partial credit, since 70% of all students answered correctly, the person that sits to your left and the person who sits to your right probably got it correct, and so you should be able to ask them and get some feedback. But if that is insufficient, please feel free to contact me if that uncertainty persists. This means, of course, that for 5 out of the 25 questions, at least 30% of all students answered incorrectly, but in some cases that means they just received partial credit. So it's not that 30% or more got the question wrong in all cases, but in the cases where there were partial credit available, some of these do qualify for that. It was a matter of not everybody got full credit. And so I will review those 5 challenging questions in what follows. Now, as you can sort of see, I've broken up the different quiz sections and the average score in terms of percentage of points on average students scored out of the possibility in each of the 6 different sections of the quiz. And you can see that the challenging questions, as well as the lower overall average score, was in the positioning portion of the quiz, the competitive advantage portion, and the added value. And of course the last 2 are towards the end of the quiz, and so there's also timing effects there, meaning that people, if they run out of time, or if they're running tight on time or rushing, it's usually on those latter sections as opposed to the earlier sections. But still, it'll let me, the fact that there's 2 questions in each of those last sections will allow me to make sure that we understand the principles there. First, in terms of positioning, we had 1 challenging question on positioning. It was question number 2 in that section, and it was the following. Which of the following is not a key variable to consider when choosing the best position for an organization along the productivity frontier? Is it A, location and magnitude of customer preferences, positions, or ideal points along the frontier? The relative operational effectiveness at different points along the frontier? The magnitude of added value achievable at different points along the frontier? The potential value of the organization can achieve at different points along the frontier? Or is it E, the positioning of competitors or alternatives along the frontier? Right. And again, we're finding the one that is not a key variable to consider when choosing the best position for an organization along the productivity frontier. So to figure that answer out, we'll go back to the slides we presented on which variables are important to consider when you're choosing the best position along the frontier. And you'll remember, of course, when we're talking about the frontier, think about it in terms of, we talked about the productivity frontier being sort of a frontier along which there's an inherent trade-off between advantages, and that the state of the art at any point in time dictates the productivity frontier in terms of what's possible in terms of balancing these 2 advantages. And whereas we said, you have the frontier sort of goes from high willingness to pay high cost at one end to low willingness to pay low cost at the other end, assuming, in this particular example, that we're balancing off the 2 advantages of degree of differentiation and relative cost, right? And then there's, of course, various positions in between that have sort of a medium willingness to pay, medium cost. Now, strategic positioning, we then said, of course, is about choosing a unique point along the productivity frontier. And so we had the following slide or discussion where I said, the question that's fair to ask and it gets asked is, what is the best position along the frontier to pursue? Right? Which is, in fact, exactly the question that's being asked, in the quiz, or at least which factors should you consider? Well, the answer, we said, to what is the best position along the frontier to pursue, the answer is the position where you achieve the greatest added value, right? Given the potential value created, right, by the firm or organization, the competitor positions along the frontier, and the customer positions along the frontier, right? So that in and of itself gives us a bit of the answer to the quiz question, but we will go into more depth here. But first, if we go back to the quiz question and then simply superimpose what we just saw, what is the best position along the frontier to pursue? Remember, the answer was the position where you achieve the greatest added value, right? So therefore, we clearly, one of the things to consider is item C here. The magnitude of the added value achievable at different points along the frontier is indeed something to consider when choosing where to be along the frontier. But that is driven by three factors. So the position where you achieve the greatest added value given the potential value created, the competitor positions, and the customer positions. So again, if we look here on our options, the potential value created, that's answer D, so that's something to be considered. The competitor positions, item E, of course, that is something that's to be considered there as well. That determines basically the added value. And item A, or the location and magnitude of customer preferences, positions or ideal points along the frontier. So again, just from that alone, we sort of see that it looks like the one item that we are not being told to consider at this point is item B, the relative operational effectiveness at different points along the frontier. But let's go a little further. Okay, you may remember this slide that went further into that topic. And we talked about, and we don't have to go into the details of the slide at this point, but remember that when deciding where to position yourself along the frontier, the first thing we talked about was the potential value created, so the willingness to pay minus the cost, the competitor positions along the frontier, and the customer positions, or the ideal points along the frontier. And then pointed out that you should seek a position along the frontier where you can have the greatest added value. But the added value, again, is your value created minus the best rival value created. So it's going to be driven by your value created, which is the potential value created here, your best rival value created, which will be driven by competitor positions, and then, of course, by the volume, the customer positions, right? So going back to their question then, right, this confirms that when we're choosing where to position ourselves along the productivity frontier, we are concerned about the top element was the potential value the organization can create. The next element was the positioning of competitors. The next element was item A here, the customer preferences, position, or ideal points. And of course, those three items together will dictate what the real objective here is, which is the magnitude of added value achieved at different points along the frontier. And so it's certainly, again, operational effectiveness, again, is not something that we consider when choosing where to position along the frontier. But that begs the question, well, what is operational effectiveness and how does that come into play? Well, you may remember, again, whereas strategic positioning is about choosing a position along the frontier, we talked about operational effectiveness being about achieving and extending best practice and strengthening both advantages at the same time such that you're moving towards the frontier, right? And so by definition, in that sense, therefore, operational effectiveness does not dictate where you position along the frontier. It's not even about moving along the frontier. It's about moving towards the frontier. So we could then confirm, of course, that the relative operational effectiveness at different points along the frontier, if you're on the frontier, then you are operational effective by definition. And so therefore, that is not a consideration when choosing the best position for an organization along the productivity frontier. So that, again, was the only question in the first 4 sections of the quiz that were problematic, and the other 4 challenging questions were in the last 2 sections. The 5th and second to last section was on competitive advantage, and there were 2 questions there, number 1 and number 5, which presented some difficulties. First, question 1, and you'll see we'll go into a little detail on this one to sort of make sure that you understand exactly what's going on here. So the question was, a strategy which achieves a low cost advantage always involves which of the following? A, lowering costs and lowering prices equivalently relative to the average competitor. Lowering the cost below the average competitor while keeping prices about the same as the average competitor. Raising prices while lowering costs. Incurring costs that is some measure below that of the average competitor, but maintaining a willingness to pay that is not as far below the willingness to pay of the average competitor, or none of the above. Right? Now, there's no question there's a lot of things to think about there, but we're talking about costs, prices, and willingness to pay. If you have a low cost advantage, what does that mean in terms of how your costs, your prices, and your willingness to pay compare with competitors? And notice that it's asking you which when you achieve low cost advantage, which always must be true, right? And so let's again go back to what we talked about in terms of low cost advantage. We presented these slides on the types of competitive advantage, right? And the example we gave of a low cost advantage was this here. It was happened to be firm C and D, and we talked about firm C now being the low cost advantage. Now, the fact that firm C has a cost of 2 per unit, while the rival, the average rival, or the only rival, depending on how you want to interpret it, has a cost of 4, that means firm C is indeed has a low cost position. But one of the points was, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean they have an advantage. You can have low cost, but not necessarily an advantage. But being low cost just means that you have a cost below your rival or below the average rival. But the other thing to point out is the value created, which is the willingness to pay minus cost. And so 8 minus 2 is 6, 9 minus 4 is 5. So the value created for firm C is 6. The value created for firm D is 5. And it is that which says that not only are you low cost firm C, but firm C also has an advantage because the gap between willingness to pay and cost is larger than the average rival. Right. So being low cost does not necessarily mean you have an advantage, but having a low cost advantage means you have a cost below the average rival's cost, and that your gap between willingness to pay and cost is larger than the average rival. Right. And then what happens to price? Because again, remember the question's asking about relative willingness to pay, relative cost, relative prices. The price depends on the firm cost and the size of the advantage. For the disadvantaged firm, right, the idea here is that the price gets driven down to cost. Right? They have to price, firm D has to offer price equal to cost. For the advantaged firm, the price is going to be the cost plus advantage. Right? So there's some value captured by firm C because they can price above cost. Right? And how much they can price above cost is exactly equal to the size of their advantage or their added value, as we'll would later define it. So again, notice here what we have is, what do we have? We have a firm who has low cost advantage. They won't always necessarily look exactly like this, but this is an example of how a firm could have a low cost advantage. And in this example, firm C's cost is lower, price is lower, and willingness to pay. All three are lower than firm D. Right? So let's go back to the options here. Let's go through them one by one. So a strategy which achieves a low cost advantage always involves, what about A? Lowering costs and lowering prices equivalently relative to the average competitor. So lower costs and prices by the same amount. So relative to the average competitor, if your costs are $1 lower, your prices are $1 lower. That's what it's saying. Well, again, looking at our example here, in our example, we have firm C's price is $1 lower than firm D, but firm C's cost is $2 lower than firm D. So again, is it possible, are there scenarios in which again, what I'm trying to say is that this demonstrates quite clearly, simply by counterexample, that it's not always the case that you lower prices and costs by the same amount relative to the average competitor. In this case, we again see cost lower by 2 and price lower only by 1. In fact, if you lowered cost and price by the same amount, so if you go back to that option, think about this. If you were lowering cost and lowering prices equivalently, right, then you've done nothing to increase your margin relative to the competitor, right? Because what you've done, of course, your margin is price minus cost, and so if you lower your cost by $1 and lower your price by $1, you're having the exact same profit, exact same margin. You're really not, exercising any advantage there. And so again, A makes the least amount of sense probably of all the answers, because it doesn't actually leverage your advantage. But also, we've shown by counterexample that it's not always the case, right? So A is not something that always occurs with a low cost advantage. What about B? Lowering costs below the average competitor while keeping prices about the same as the average competitor. Well, so same prices, lower cost. Well, let's look again, go back to our example that we used in class. Well, lower costs, yes, right? The first part of that, again, B, is lowering costs below the average competitor while keeping prices about the same. Lower costs, yes. So this is firm C has lower costs than firm D. Price is the same? Well, no. Firm C has a price of 3, and firm 4 has a price. Firm C has a price of 3, and firm D is a price of 4. So firm C has a lower price, right? And you might say, well, they're about the same. Well, okay. Well, we could just simply take firm C's diagram here and lower it, again and again. Instead of, and this could be cost of 1, willingness to pay of 7, and the price would then be down to 2. And you could have the price anywhere, significantly below the competitor, right? In a scenario with a low cost advantage. So the idea that here the low example the price is lower, but you certainly could be, even further below the competitor in your terms of your price, right? Because your price is simply going to be whatever your cost is plus the magnitude of your advantage. So depending on how much of a cost advantage you have, that'll dictate how much lower your prices are. So lowering costs below the average competitor while keeping prices about the same as the average competitor, right? That is certainly not something that always occurs. Again, by the example, and moreover, I could have even more extreme examples as I described. And a third reason would be, of course, that typically, of course, if you keep your prices, if you lower your costs, but you keep your price about the same as the average competitor, it's not clear that you're going to get anybody to buy your product as opposed to buying the competitors, unless you have higher willingness to pay than the competitor. But then you'd have higher willingness to pay, then you would have a dual advantage, not just a low cost advantage. And moreover, you typically, when you have a low cost advantage, you have a lower willingness to pay than the competitor, as we saw in the example here. Again, you have a lower willingness to pay than the competitor. So if you kept prices about the same, nobody would buy from you, right? So again, B, just logically, but also from the diagram, is clearly not something that's going to be always involved in a low cost advantage. What about C, raising prices while lowering cost? Is that something that is always part of a low cost advantage scenario? Okay, well, lower cost, yes. Raising prices, no. Again, we just said that prices, here an example, prices lower. We said prices can be significantly lower, right, than the competitor, right? In fact, that's usually the case. As you lower your cost, you lower your price. That's sort of the value proposition that you have for the customer. So again, raising prices while lowering costs, that's generally, frankly, not something part of a low cost advantage, but it's certainly not something that is always part of a low cost advantage. And so finally, we're left with D, right? Incurring costs that is some measure below that of the average competitor, right? And of course, all of these involve having costs below the average competitor. That's sort of inherent. We know that with low cost. So incurring costs that is some measure below that of the average competitor, but maintaining a willingness to pay that is not as far below the willingness to pay of the average competitor, not as far as below as your cost is. So let's go back to the diagram again, right? And here we see having a low cost position requires your cost be lower. But having an advantage requires that your gap between willingness to pay and cost be larger. So what does that mean? Well, that means that you have to lower cost relative to the average competitor by more than you lower willingness to pay. In this example, cost is $2 lower for firm C than firm D, and willingness to pay is only $1 lower. If the willingness to pay was $2 lower, right? So in other words, if both cost and willingness to pay went down by $2, right, then firm C would have no advantage. Right? They would have the same value created, and they would be able to offer nothing better in terms of value you could offer the customer to capture. Right? And so it has to be the case. It has to be the case to actually have an advantage with a low cost position. To have a low cost advantage requires that you have your costs lower than the competitor, and your willingness to pay is likely below the competitor. If it's not, you have a dual advantage, right? It's not a low cost advantage. But your willingness to pay is lower than the competitor, but not by as much. Not as you mean in here, for example, willingness to pay is $1 lower, cost is $2 lower. You've got to have a larger cost difference than you do a willingness to pay difference. Otherwise, your gap is not going to be larger and you're not going to have an advantage. So again, D, or incurring costs that is some measure below that of the average competitor, correct, but maintaining one pay that is not as far below the one that's paid the average competitor. And that again, your one's pay, is not as far below the one's pay the average competitor as your cost is below that of the average competitor, right? And that is exactly what it takes to have a low cost advantage. And therefore, of course, since that's the correct answer, then the answer E, none of the above, is not an option, right? All right. In future years, by the way, just to, I don't think a lot of people chose none of the above, but just to make it clear that one of these is the answer, so therefore you're choosing among best options, I'll probably eliminate option E. Every year when I have a question that people find difficult, I actually make it easier for the next, I don't use the same questions every year, but I sort of rotate them. So this will show up probably, in the quiz a couple years from now, and I will have made it easier. So just trust that the point being that I don't try to make them difficult. In fact, I actually go out of my way to make them easier, or at least more straightforward. All right, so the next question that was problematic was question 5 in the competitive advantage section, and it was a true or false question. True or false, a firm cannot have a competitive advantage unless it generates a willingness to pay which is higher than the willingness to pay of all rivals, and or incurs a cost to produce or serve that is lower than the cost of all rivals. So basically it's saying the only way you can have a competitive advantage, you've either got to have a willingness to pay that's higher than all rivals, or a cost that's lower than all rivals, or both, right? Well, certainly to have a higher willingness to pay than all rivals and have a lower cost than all rivals would be great. That's what we call a dual advantage. But do you need to have one or the other? Well, remember this example of the mixed advantage, right? We have firm G. In our example, it was firm G. Remember that it had willingness to pay of 8, cost of 2 per unit. Firm H had willingness to pay of 9, cost of 4 per unit. Firm I had willingness to pay of 6, cost of 1 per unit, right? And the value created, willingness to pay minus cost, was 6 for firm G, 5 for firm H, and 5 for firm I. And so in competition, what happens is they're each trying to offer the best value capture to the customer, and the customer is going to, of course, look at willingness to pay minus price, and they're going to keep competing price down to the point where firms H and I can't lower their price anymore. They're pricing at cost. Firm G is offering a price of 3, which gives the customer a capture of 5, right? 8 minus 3 is 5. And that's the best that either competitor can do, right? And that still leaves room for firm G to have a profit. And again, firm G has an advantage because it creates more value. It has a larger gap to willingness to pay and cost. But note that the firm G does not have a higher willingness to pay than all of its rivals, right? It has a higher willingness to pay than firm I, but not than firm H, right? So it does not have a differentiated position, right? It's differentiated relative to firm I, but not firm H. Firm G also does not have a lower cost than all of its rivals. It's got a lower cost than firm H, but not lower cost than firm I. It's got a low cost relative to firm H, but not lower cost relative to firm I. So it's not the case that firm G is neither has the highest willingness to pay among the options, nor the lowest cost. So but yet firm G has a competitive advantage because its gap between willingness to pay and cost is greater than all of its rivals. So we go back to true or false. A firm cannot have a competitive advantage unless it generates a willingness to pay which is higher than the willingness to pay of all rivals, and or incurs a cost to produce or serve that's lower than the cost of all rivals. Well, no, that's false. If they have a mixed advantage, what really matters is just that the gap between willingness to pay and cost is greater, right? And so it's not necessary to have the higher willingness to pay than all rivals or have lower cost than all rivals, right? It simply requires that your gap between willingness to pay and cost be the greatest. All right. So then the last 2 questions for which that students found challenging was in the section on added value, and these are questions number 3 and number 4. Number 3 asks the following: true or false? In theory, at least, a firm should always capture no more and no less than its added value. Right? So you should capture exactly your added value in competition. Well, again, added value, remember just defining it, is the total value created with the organization in the environment minus the total value created without the organization in the environment. So added value is the value that would be lost to the world if the organization disappeared. But again, maybe the first definition is critical here. The total value created with the organization in the environment minus the total value created without the organization in the environment. Right? So first we said, and these are slides straight out of class, can you expect to capture more than your added value? Well, the answer is no. If you try to do so, some other players could exclude you, make a separate deal on their own, and all end up better off. In other words, end up capturing more value. Remember, the idea here is that the added value is what you bring additionally to the table. If you are trying to capture more than you bring to the table, others are all better off excluding you. They can do better without you. Right? And so we gave the example of that low-cost advantage firm that we just described. If they try to charge a higher price, right, then the rival firm could charge a price that allows them to charge a profit, to receive a profit, and gives customers more value than firm C. So you cannot, capture or try to capture more than well, you cannot. You can try. You can't successfully capture more than added value. So, so it is true, the first part of that true-false, that you cannot expect to capture more than your added value. But what about the other side? Can you expect to capture your entire added value? Well, that answer is no also. Your value capture also depends on the added values of buyers, suppliers, and complementers. The problem is that nobody can capture more than their added value, but it might be that your added values add up to more than the total value available. So we said, consider the situation where there's a firm who has one firm with a cost of 10 and one customer with a willingness to pay of 20. This is what we call bilateral monopoly, right? You have one buyer, one seller, or a monopoly, which is one seller, or in a monopsony, which is one buyer. So they each need each other. They don't have any other options. So if the cost is 10 and the willingness to pay is 20, we know the price is going to be somewhere between 10 and 20. Right? What it is, it could be 15, it could be 16 for various reasons, but the bottom line is that the total value created, right, is going to be willingness to pay minus cost, or 20 minus 10. So 10. But the total value created without the firm or without the customer is 0, right? Without the firm, the customer has nobody to buy from. Without the customer, the firm has nobody to sell to. This is the only customer, and this is the only provider, right? So therefore, value is created with both of them in the world. Value of 10 is created. If either one is taken out, then the value created is 0. So therefore, they each have the same added value, which is 10. But the firm value captured plus the customer value captured has to be equal to 10 combined, right? Think about if the price is 15, then the firm captures 5 and the customer captures 5. 15 minus 10 is 5, 20 minus the one's pay of 20 minus the price of 15 is 5. If the price is, say, 18, right, then the firm captures 8, 18 minus 10, and the customer captures 2, 20 minus 18. No matter what it is, the combined total value captured is 10. Therefore, as you can see here, each of them has an added value of 10, but it's impossible for them both to capture their full added value because they would have to each capture 20. Each capture 10 for a total capture of 20. Well, that's not possible. The total value that can be shared among them is 10. So again, added value is an upper bound on what you can capture, but you should not expect to capture your full added value. So a firm should always capture no more and no less than its added value. That answer, they should capture no more, but they will frequently capture less than their added value. So again, that is false. Right? And so then the last question that was challenging was another true-false on added value. True or false, as long as a firm has any positive added value, it has a competitive advantage relative to its rivals. All right. Well, this again really has to do with the definitions of competitive advantage and the definitions of added value. We've already defined added value, right? We've defined competitive advantage actually here today when we talked about the low cost advantage or the idea or being that in order to have an advantage, we talked about the mixed advantage. You have to have a higher gap between willingness to pay and cost than any of the alternatives. So you could just from what we've already said infer the correct answer here. But let me actually just quote directly from your reading that you had on competitive advantage. So what did they say about the two concepts, added value and competitive advantage? Well, here are 3 different quotes actually from 3 different places in the reading. In the beginning of the reading, it says, quote, a firm that has a competitive advantage is one that has added value. So if you have competitive advantage, you have added value. If you have added value, you have competitive advantage. These are the same thing. Or here, in more detail, a firm can boost its added value by widening the wedge between customer willingness to pay and supplier opportunity cost. We say that a firm with a wider wedge than its rivals has a competitive advantage in the industry. That firm has added value and therefore the potential for profit. Right? This is actually in the middle of the reading in a section called added value and competitive advantage. So again, it's saying that to have added value is to have competitive advantage. And finally, at the end, sort of the conclusion, there's a bullet point that says, To have added value, a firm must drive a wedge between customers' willingness to pay and supplier opportunity cost. Indeed, a wider wedge than firms' rivals can achieve. A firm that attains a wider wedge is said to have a competitive advantage. So again, to have a competitive advantage is to have some positive added value. Therefore, as long as a firm has any positive added value, it has a competitive advantage relative to its rivals. Yes, that's what competitive advantage means in added value terms. And that's what added value means. So that answer is in fact true. All right, and so that covers, again, those are the 5 questions for which that a fair number of you, 30% or more, did not receive full credit at least on them or found them challenging. So, if you have questions about other ones, not those 5 I went over, again, see if you can, like I said, those are ones that 70% or more of students got full credit on. So you can certainly ask your colleagues about that. But if you're still not satisfied, don't hesitate to email me or contact me or call me, and we can talk about it. But hopefully that answers most of the questions or curiosities. We will be recording and I'll be providing another one of these videos for the Module 4 quiz, which, of course, you won't complete until after the course is finished. But as soon as you submit that quiz or get all those quizzes, I will do the same thing I've done here. All right, thank you.